Good evening. Great to be learning with you on a Tuesday, Yom Shlishi. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Paul in the Great Northwest, Lucy in Minnesota, Shandora in the Bronx, John in Maine, Bella in Florida, Sharon in New Jersey, and it skipped on me again. Here we go. Sharon in New Jersey, Nancy, North Carolina, Renee in Indiana, Melissa in Great Neck, Ryan in Florida, Belle in Texas, and Joseph in Massachusetts, Robert in Allentown, Peggy in Colorado, Bill in mid-Missouri. Welcome, everybody. This daf is somewhat of a thick one, so let's get into it so we don't run long. We are in Tractate Gittin, the 19th volume of the Talmud. Our daf today, our page is Yud Beis, page 12. We have just commenced Mishnah number 5. We read the Mishnah yesterday. Today we start the Gemara on Mishnah number 5. Basic idea, if a husband sends a get, a bill of divorce, to his wife via a messenger, once he gives it to the messenger, can he retract? Can he say, I changed my mind, I don't want to deliver the get. I don't want to divorce her. Stop it. I've retracted. Can he do that? Yes. We've had a comparison on several issues between a get, a bill of divorce, and a bill of manumission, meaning in ancient times when slavery existed, a master could free the slave via this document, the bill of manumission. If the master hands the bill of manumission to an agent of delivery who's going to take it to the slave, can he change his mind before the slave receives the document? Just like he can change his mind before the wife receives the document. Once she receives the get, she's divorced. The husband can't change his mind. But until she has received it, he can retract. But with the slave owner, as soon as he hands that bill of manumission into the hands of the agent of delivery who's going to bring it to the slave, that's it. The slave is free. Why? What's the difference? Why is that the husband can retract up until the time the wife receives the get versus the slave owner who does not have the opportunity to retract up until the moment that the slave receives the bill of manumission, but rather once he hands it off to the agent of delivery, it's a done deal. And the difference is that the agent of delivery, once he receives the bill of manumission, is acting as an agent not only for the slave owner who said, please deliver this for me, but he's also acting as the agent for the slave himself. The agent of delivery receives the bill of manumission on behalf of the slave. And the slave is actually free from the moment that the agent of delivery receives the bill of manumission from the slave owner. Why doesn't that work for the get? Because when the agent of delivery receives the get, he can't acquire that on behalf of the wife. Why? Because she hasn't received it yet. She didn't appoint him. So since he's not her appointed agent, he can't receive it on her behalf because the get is to her detriment, right? It's better off for her to be married than to be divorced. Even though we understand that there are many situations where the couple is better off divorced, the wife is better off divorced. Nonetheless, as a general rule, the wife is not better off divorced, and so the agent of delivery cannot accept the get on her behalf. But as a general rule, a slave is better off not a slave. And so the agent of delivery can receive the bill of manumission on behalf of the slave, and the slave is free from that moment forward. And that's why the slave owner cannot retract after he hands off the bill of manumission to the agent of delivery. That is the basic Mishnah. Let's get into the Gemara. We pick this up near the bottom of page 11b. The Gemara relates, Rav Huna and Rav Yitzhak Bar Yosef were sitting before Rabbi Yirmiyah. And Rabbi Yirmiyah was sitting and dozing while the other two sages conversed. And Rav Huna was sitting and saying, with regard to the statement of the rabbis, the majority, that a master cannot retract a bill of manumission once he has given it to an agent, for the reasons we just explained. One can conclude from it that if a third party seizes a debtor's property on behalf of a creditor, an act that is certainly in the interest of the creditor, he acquires this property on his behalf. And this is similar to the case here where the agent acquires the bill of manumission on behalf of the slave. Right? So you have this idea that without the knowledge, right, because neither the slave nor the wife knows that an agent was appointed to deliver that bill to them. Right? So it wasn't appointed by the wife or by the slave. But so what we see is the principle that an agent, even without being appointed, can acquire something on your behalf without the knowledge of the recipient in cases where it is to your advantage to acquire that thing on your behalf, right? So even though the agent was not appointed by you, he can act on your behalf if it's to your benefit, even without your knowledge. But if there's any aspect where it's not to your benefit, then he can't act without your knowledge. And that's why the agent cannot acquire the get on behalf of the wife, but he can acquire the bill of manumission on behalf of the slave. So the Gemara is making a parallel. Okay, so if you have a situation where somebody goes into debt and he owes money to several people around town, they are his creditors, right? And he has some movable property that could be repoed, right? It could be repossessed. Now, let's say that there's a third party who is not an employee, has not been appointed as an agent by one of those creditors, but he happens to know that all these creditors who are kind of competing with each other to get the assets of the person who owes money all over town, this third party knows that his friend, who's one of the creditors, would like to just take that movable property to satisfy the obligation of the debtor toward this particular creditor. So that third party can seize it because the creditor has the right to seize that movable property. Only because of that, right? Because the creditor has the right to seize that movable property of the debtor, this third party can step in out of nowhere and seize the movable property on behalf of that creditor who doesn't know that that movable property just became available. Because it is to the creditor's benefit, this unappointed third party can step in as the creditor's agent and seize the movable property. That is what Rav Huna and Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef are saying, right? Rav Huna, I think is the one, Rav Huna says this. Rabbi Yirmiyah, who's there with them, there's three sages there, but one of them is asleep. So Rav Huna says this to his buddy in the presence of Rav Yirmiyah, who's asleep. Now, Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef said to Rav Huna, do you state this law even in a case when the seizure of property is to the detriment of others? Right? Because let's say there's only one creditor who's been trying to get a loan paid back. This third party can definitely step in when the repossessible, movable property becomes available, and he can grab it on behalf of the creditor for the creditor's benefit. But if there's multiple creditors, well, then when this third party steps in and he grabs the movable property of the debtor on behalf of one of the creditors, that's good for that creditor, but not for the other creditors who now don't have a chance to get their to get the loan paid back, because whatever little assets the debtor had have already been shifted to one of the creditors. Now, any one of those creditors would have the right to grab that movable property if he was there. But this unappointed third-party agent, can he seize it on behalf of one of the creditors at the expense of the other creditors? Asks Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef to Rav Huna, and Rav Huna says to him, yes, he can seize it on behalf of one of the creditors, even if it's to the detriment of the other creditors. In the meantime, Rabbi Yirmiyah woke up, and due to their conversation, as he was not sleeping deeply, and he overheard this last part of the conversation, and he said to them, children, Dardeki, this is what Rabbi Yochanan says. One who seizes property on behalf of a creditor in a case where it is to the detriment of others does not acquire. This third party cannot step in and seize the movable property on behalf of one of the creditors if that is to the detriment of the other creditors. So says Rabbi Yirmiyah, hey, Rav Huna, you got this one wrong. And if you say that our Mishnah apparently teaches the opposite because the agent of delivery can receive the slave's bill of manumission on behalf of the slave, how is that to the detriment of others? Well, presumably the master, right? He's the one who's going to lose a slave. So it's to his detriment if that agent of delivery can accept the bill of manumission and the slave is free right now, as opposed to when the agent of delivery gets to the slave and then hands it to them, so he won't be free until he actually receives the bill of manumission. Now we're saying the agent of delivery can acquire that bill of manumission on the slave's behalf as soon as he receives it, right? Before the travel time. Which would be to the detriment of the master. But if it's to the detriment of the master, it shouldn't work, because we just learned that if this third party agent seizes movable property on behalf of one of the creditors to the detriment of the other creditors, he does not acquire. Doesn't it seem to be the same principle, and yet it works in one case and not in the other? Now, Rabbi Yirmiyah elaborates. The reason for the ruling in the Mishnah is that anyone who says give to so-and-so is like one who says acquire on behalf of so. Like, you can't say that it's to the master's detriment, that the agent of delivery acquires the bill of manumission on behalf of the slave as soon as it's handed to him, because the only one who has a detriment in that is the master who is handing the bill of manumission to the agent. That's not going to count because he's already discounted his own detriment. He's giving the bill of manumission. Now, Rav Chisda says, with regard to this issue of one who seizes property on behalf of a creditor, in a case where it is to the detriment of others, so we have arrived at the dispute between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis. Okay, so understand we're going on a bit of a digression now. We got there because the agent of delivery can accept the bill of manumission on the slave's behalf, even though the slave is unaware that it's being accepted for him, because it is to the slave's advantage. And we're comparing that to, can a third party acquire movable property on behalf of one of a group of creditors in the case where a debtor is not paying all these creditors. Okay, now we're going to get into that area of the law a little bit. So we have a dispute between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis, right? Between Rabbi Eliezer, who's in the minority, and the rabbis, who are in the majority. What is this dispute? As we learned in a Mishna, Peah 4:9, with regard to one who is not poor, but collected produce in the corner of the field, which is given to the poor, right? So when a farmer in Israel is harvesting his crop, he is obligated by halacha, by Jewish law, to leave the corners of the field unharvested so that the poor can come along and harvest those corners of the field for their own benefit so that they can eat and not starve. Now, one who is not poor, can he go and harvest those corners not for himself, because he's not poor, but on behalf of the poor? Can he act as an agent for the poor? Right, so you're going to see how this ties to this creditor situation, because this one who is not poor is going to acquire on behalf of the poor. But if he acquires, particular fields, corners on behalf of one poor person, so then he has taken the ability away from other poor people to harvest those corners. So has he in fact acquired those corner harvests on behalf of this one poor person? That's the question they're going to ask. With regard to one who is not poor, but collected produce in the corner of the field, which is given to the poor. And he said, this produce that I've collected is for so-and-so, who is a poor person. So Rabbi Eliezer says he has acquired it on behalf of that poor person. And the rabbis in the majority say he has not acquired it on behalf of that person. Rather, this produce that he seized, he has to give it to the first poor person that appears before him. So apparently, Rabbi Eliezer holds that one can gather peah, the corner of the field, on behalf of a particular poor person, despite the fact that he acts to the detriment of other paupers, while the rabbis disagree with this. Now, a Maimar said, and some say that it was actually Rav Papa who said, now we're on 12a, well, perhaps that is not so. Perhaps this is not the point of dispute between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis. Right? What they said is one who harvests the corner of the field for a particular poor person, Rabbi Eliezer says he can do that, and the rabbis say no, he can't do that. If he has done it, he has to give it away to the first poor person he meets. Now, maybe the operating principle in that dispute is this idea that you can acquire on behalf of a creditor only if it doesn't, and somehow hurt other creditors. But maybe that's not the operating issue. The Gemara is going to suggest something different. So there are two ways to explain why this might not be analogous to the creditor dispute. First, it is possible that Rabbi Eliezer states his opinion only there, when the person took possession of the payah, despite not being able to collect it for himself because he's not poor, but we understand that if the one who collected the produce desired, he could declare all his own property ownerless and instantly become a poor person, right? A person who has assets in this world could say, you know what? I don't want to own anything. I hereby, at Blineder, I'm just saying this for a teaching example, a person could say, I hereby declare all of my property ownerless. So he doesn't own it anymore. He's suddenly a poor person. Since a person always has the option to do that, he could do that if he wanted, so that he could then become a poor person. So he's in the same class of people as actual poor people. He hasn't made that declaration. He's not a poor person. But because he could make that declaration, he's not a different species of person than poor people, right? He's also a human being who has the potential to become poor. And so because he could declare his property ownerless and become a poor person, and then the produce would have been fit for him to retain himself. And since he could have acquired the payah for himself if he was a poor person, so he could be acquiring it for himself, thinking, I will declare all my property ownerless and then I'll need it. So even though I haven't done that yet, I'm acquiring it for myself. He has the capacity to do that. So likewise, he can acquire it for another as well. However, here, where he seizes property on behalf of a creditor, he cannot seize that property for himself. He's not one of the creditors. He can't become one of the creditors, right? I mean, there could be some other transaction in the future, but he's not in the same class as the creditors because he's not currently a creditor. Now, I hear you saying, well, he's not currently a poor person either. He would have to declare his property ownerless to become a poor person. But that's in his power to do. You can't declare that you are a creditor of an individual who doesn't in fact owe you money. So it's not in your power to declare yourself a creditor of some other person. And for that reason, the cases are different. Second, one could also argue that there's another difference between the creditor dispute and this, non-poor person acquiring the payah, the corner of the field, on behalf of poor people, which Eliezer allows and the rabbis don't. A different way to explain that doesn't refer to the creditor dispute is like this. The rabbis who say that he cannot acquire on behalf of a particular poor person, but if he picks the corner, he has to give it to the first poor person he meets. The rabbis state their opinion only there, that one cannot acquire on behalf of the poor person, as it is written, quote, in Leviticus 23:22, the corner of your field you shall not reap, and the gleaning of your harvest you shall not gather. For the poor you shall leave them. And the sages expounded this verse by reading it as though there were no break in the middle. Not the corner of the field you shall not reap, and the gleaning of your harvest you shall not gather. For the poor you shall leave them, but rather you shall not gather for the poor. Right? They take out, since there's no punctuation in the Torah, there's not, right? We sort of infer the punctuation. So instead of you shall not gather, you'll leave it for the poor, you could read it as you shall not gather for the poor, meaning the poor have to do their own gathering. You can't be the one who do it for them. However, here in the creditor dispute, where one seizes property on behalf of a particular creditor, this verse does not apply, and therefore the rabbis did not rule that the action of the third party is ineffective. Consequently, it is possible that the dispute between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis with regard to Peah is not with regard to the issue of whether or not one can seize property on behalf of a creditor. Now the Gemara asks, and as for Rabbi Eliezer, with regard to this verse, you shall not gather for the poor, what does he do with that reading of the verse? How does he interpret this phrase? And the Gemara answers, he requires it to warn a poor person with regard to his own field, right? Even if you're poor and you have, but you at least have a field, even though you're very poor and are barely eking by, you still have to leave the corner of your field for other poor people to come by. He's not so, you might think, well, he's not so poor. He's got a field at least, but who knows? There's been a drought, he's starving, it could be really bad. Nevertheless, if he's got a field and he harvests it, he has to leave the corners for other poor people. Now the Mishna taught, if the master wishes, so in the Mishnah, in our Mishnah here, number 5, we saw that there was a dissenting opinion on whether the agent of delivery who receives the bill of manumission acquires it on behalf of the slave because it's only to the benefit of the slave to become free. Rabbi Meir says, whoa. Are you so sure that it's to the slave's benefit to become free? If he's the slave of a Cohen, of a priest, so because he's the slave of a priest, he is qualified to eat terumah, food that is consecrated for the use of priests and their households, including their slaves, which other Jews cannot eat. So if a slave of a Cohen becomes free, he loses the ability to eat terumah. That is a disadvantage. How can you say it is only an advantage to become free? Maybe he'd rather stay a slave and be able to eat terumah. You can imagine there's been a terrible drought and the only food around is the terumah belonging to the priests. Then in that situation, a slave would rather be a slave so that he could keep eating. Now that's such an unlikely and unusual scenario that probably the sages did not decree on behalf of, in light of such an uncommon occurrence. But we come back to this idea now in the Gemara. Our Mishnah taught, as if the master wishes not to sustain his slave, he is allowed to act accordingly. Now this was the answer to Rabbi Meir when he said, hey, the slave might not want to give up eating terumah. And the rabbi said to Rabbi Meir, the master is not obligated to sustain his slave. You might think, a slave is owned by this master. You would think that the master has an obligation to feed the slave. But that's not necessarily true. When slavery existed, it was an absolute ownership, particularly with Canaanite slaves. So the master could say to the slave, I'm not going to feed you. Feed yourself. I'll leave you enough hours in the day for you to do the kind of work that will get you some food on your plate. But that's your problem, not mine. And that's actually legal. Right? So since the slave can't count on being sustained by the master, the fact that he's allowed to eat terumah doesn't mean that the master's gonna give him terumah, and therefore it sounds harsh, but what this does is that it is always to the slave's advantage to receive the bill of manumission, and therefore the agent can receive it on his behalf. You see how a stringency in one area of the law produces a leniency in another. All right, so the Mishnah taught, as if the master wishes to say, I will not sustain you, to his slave, he can do so. And the Gemara comments conclude from the Mishnah that the master is legally able to say to his slave, work for me, but I will not sustain you, right? There's no Fair Labor Standards Act, right? This is slavery. This is the horrors of slavery. So the master could say, work for me, but I will not sustain you. However, the Gemara rejects this claim. No, you can't do that. This is not a conclusive proof. As with what are we dealing in the Mishnah? We are dealing with a case where the master said to the slave, spend your earnings to sustain yourself. In other words, I will not provide for you. Rather, you must work and earn money for your sustenance on your own. However, this does not mean that a master can force his slave to work for him without providing him with sustenance. Now, the Gemara asks, if so, in the corresponding situation in our Mishnah with regard to a wife, right, where we learn that the agent of delivery cannot acquire the get, the bill of divorce on her behalf, because it's to her detriment to be divorced. Why is it to her detriment? Specifically because a husband is obligated to sustain his wife. He has to make sure that she is fed, clothed, sheltered, etc. And once she's divorced, the husband no longer has that obligation. So that's a difference that we're seeing. Well, a master is not obligated to sustain his slave, but a husband is obligated to sustain his wife. And that's why the agent of delivery can acquire the bill of manumission on the slave's behalf, but cannot acquire the get on the wife's behalf. But now that you're saying, whoa, no, actually the master is obligated to sustain the slave, well, then that's just like the husband is obligated to sustain the wife. So maybe the agent of delivery can acquire the bill of... You're saying that according to one view, the master is not obligated to sustain the slave. Is it possible that the husband is not obligated to sustain the wife? And if so, then it's not to her detriment to receive the get, and then the agent of delivery could acquire it on her behalf, right? They're just drawing parallels and testing them. Obviously, that it's going to fail. The argument is going to fail. This sort of seedling argument is going to fail, but they're still planting it to show where and how it fails, right? Right, so in the Gemara asks, if so, in the corresponding situation in our Mishnah with regard to a wife, will one explain that he could have said to her, spend your earnings to sustain yourself? The Mishnah rules that one cannot exempt himself from his obligation to provide sustenance for his wife. So in the case of a wife, why may he not do so? It is certainly permitted for a husband to stipulate with his wife that she will keep her earnings and not receive sustenance from him. And yet it is clear in the Mishnah that there is a difference between a slave and a wife with regard to his ability to refuse to provide sustenance. And the Gemara answers, the wife mentioned in the Mishnah is one whose earnings are not sufficient for her sustenance. And in that case, the husband may not stipulate in this manner. But we learn from that, well, if actually the wife is the breadwinner, then the husband can say, well, feed yourself from your earnings. You do better than I do anyway. So you can keep your earnings. That because normally, right, when a husband acquires a wife under ancient law, he acquires her earnings. So if he's going to say, feed yourself out of your earnings, then he must be saying, okay, you keep your earnings and you feed yourself from it, and I won't be liable to sustain you. So in that case, maybe it's not to her detriment to become divorced. It's probably to her advantage if she's the breadwinner, economically speaking. So maybe in that situation, the agent of delivery could acquire the get on her behalf, and she's divorced from the moment the husband hands the get to the agent of delivery. But the Gemara raises a difficulty. If so, the case of the slave also is referring to a situation where his earnings are not sufficient for his sustenance, right? So if we're going to distinguish between a rich wife with her own wealth or her own earnings from her career versus a wife who is dependent on the husband, will we make the same distinction with a slave? Maybe there's a slave who's remember in Shawshank Redemption, what's his name? The main guy, Andy. I'm blanking on the actor's name for a moment. But at any rate, right, the main character goes to prison. He loses all his rights, right? Prisoners on a chain gang are very much like slaves. But Andy Dufresne, right? Wasn't that his name? Is a trained accountant who ends up, stealing a bunch of money on behalf of the corrupt prison warden. Right now, he's unlike the other slaves. The other slaves are just pounding rocks all day. Their labor is not worth very much. But Andy's labor is worth a whole lot of money, So if his owner, obviously that was not a slavery example, but I'm just making the distinction between, the accountant slave and the one who's breaking rocks, right? It's a very different kind of labor. So it may be that a slave's labor is enough to sustain his own needs, and it may be that another slave is not. Maybe there's a slave that, fell on hard times, physically hard time, is ill, and at that point he's not able to generate any income for the master. Does the master have to feed that slave? Under ancient laws, right? So if so, the case of the slave is also referring to a situation where his earnings are not sufficient for his sustenance, and he is unable to sustain himself. Nevertheless, his master can refuse. Tim Robbins, thank you, Mark. Therefore, one can conclude from the Mishnah that a master can say to his slave, "Work for me, but I will not sustain you." And the Gemara explains, a slave who is not worth the bread that he consumes, for what is he needed by his master or his mistress? You would think that if it starts to become a net negative to the owner to own that slave, they would probably free him and discharge the obligation. If the value of his labor does not even pay for the cost of his sustenance, why is he needed at all? So the Mishnah certainly does not refer to a case of this kind. By contrast, with regard to a wife, the marriage does not depend on her ability to provide for herself by means of her earnings. Consequently, one cannot prove from the Mishnah that a master can say to his slave, "Work for me, but I will not sustain you." It's like they're assuming that somebody could say that, and that's why because the master does not have an obligation to sustain the slave. It is always to the slave's advantage to be free, and that's why we're going to let the agent of delivery receive the bill of manumission on the slave's behalf. But is that true that a master could actually say, "Work for me and I will not sustain you"? Right? That seems to be a given, an assumption in the Mishnah that the Gemara is now testing. Why are we even talking about that, right? This is supposed to be the laws of divorce, but having brought up this subject, the sages are now exploring it. So the Gemara suggests another proof. Come in here a Baraisa from Tosefta of Makos 2:8. With regard to a slave who unintentionally killed someone and was exiled to one of the cities of refuge, his master is not required to sustain him. Right, so imagine that the slave commits manslaughter, right, an unintentional killing that would result, in a feud, right, where the relatives of the victim are going to want to come and kill the slave. And that in ancient times, that kind of blood feud was a pretty normal thing, and that's why the Torah established these cities of refuge where the manslaughterer, not a murderer, not an intentional murderer, but a manslaughterer who, through perhaps some negligence, so he has some blame, but he certainly didn't lie in wait and plan to kill the victim, where the manslaughterer can run to the city of refuge and hide out there for the lifetime of the current high priest, and when that priest transitions to the next high priest, then he can return to his home. So if the manslaughterer is a slave, you have a very interesting situation, because he would want to run to the city of refuge so he won't be killed, but now he's left the household of his master. So what good is he to his master while he's living in the city of refuge to save his life? So with regard to a slave who unintentionally killed someone and he was exiled to one of the cities of refuge, his master is not required to sustain him. And not only that, but his earnings in his city of refuge, once he gets a job, actually belong to his master. So conclude from the Baraisa that a master can say to his slave, "Work for me, but I will not sustain you," because we see that in the case of the slave who ran off to the city of refuge. And the Gemara answers, whoa, with what are we dealing here? With a case where the master said to him, "Spend your earnings to sustain yourself." So the Gemara raises another difficulty. If the master said to the slave, then if the master said this to the slave, "Spend your earnings to sustain yourself," so then why do the slave's earnings belong to the master? After all, his master stipulated that he should sustain himself. And the Gemara answers, this law is referring to his surplus earnings, i.e., If the slave works and earns more than the cost of his sustenance, his surplus income belongs to the master. He's not a free person, so his earnings belong to his master. And the Gemara asks, isn't it obvious that any surplus belongs to the master as he owns the slave? And the Gemara answers, this ruling is necessary lest you say that since when he does not work enough, the master does not give him all he needs to eat, then when he has a surplus from his work, the master should also not take it. Therefore, the Brisa teaches us that despite this consideration, the surplus belongs to the master. And the Gemara asks, and what is different with regard to a slave who was exiled to one of the cities of refuge concerning whom the Brisa was stated? According to this reasoning, the surplus should belong to the master no matter where the slave is located. And the Gemara asks, it might enter your mind to say that as the verse states with regard to one who is exiled to a city of refuge, and that fleeing to one of these cities he might live, Deuteronomy 4:42, so one should act for him so that he has extra life. I.e., in this specific case, the slave who runs to a city of refuge, he should be allowed to retain any additional amount that he earns. Therefore, the Brisa teaches us that no special obligation of this kind applies, even if the slave has been exiled to a city of refuge. He might not be able to work at home for the master, but whatever he earns beyond what he needs to eat, he has to send home to the master. The Gemara raises another difficulty, but from the fact that the latter clause of that Brisa teaches, however, with regard to a woman who is exiled to one of the cities of refuge, her husband is obligated in her sustenance. By inference, the Brisa is dealing with a case where he did not say to her, spend your earnings to sustain yourself, which is why he must sustain her. As if he said this to her, why is her husband obligated to provide her with sustenance? And from the fact that the latter clause of the Brisa is speaking about a case where he did not say this to her, it may be inferred that the first clause also is dealing with a situation where he did not say to the slave, spend your earnings and sustain yourself. The two clauses of the Brisa must be referring to similar cases, or they would not be taught together. So the Gemara rejects this claim. Actually, the Brisa is referring to a case where the master said to the slave, spend your earnings to sustain yourself. And the husband issued a similar statement to his wife. However, in the case of a woman, it is referring to a situation when her earnings are not sufficient for her sustenance, so he has to sustain her. Right? A husband will always be on the hook to sustain his wife. Even if she has greater earnings, and he could say to her, okay, keep your earnings and sustain yourself, and then he doesn't have to sustain her. But if her earnings fall, he becomes on the hook again. Whereas the master who owns a slave is not obligated, according to this view at least, to sustain his slave. Right? And if he can't, like if both the master and the slave become so poor that there's not enough to eat, this guy's got a slave. You really got to find a way to organize the slave's time so that he could earn enough to feed them both. But let's say they don't, and there's a drought, and who knows what's going on. So you might think that if they're so poor that he can't feed the slave, he should say, he should free the slave so that the slave can go somewhere else and find what to eat. But he's not obligated to free the slave in that situation. And the reason is with regard to Canaanite slaves, and that's what we're talking about here, there's an obligation not to free them, right? Not to free a Canaanite slave. That's just the particularities of history and the practices of the Canaanites before the Jews arrived, but they're obligated not to free the Canaanite slave. So what he can't do is starve the slave to death. So if he can't feed him and he can't free him, what does he do? He sends him out to get charity so that he can eat, but he doesn't have to free him. But there we see that he's not obligated to sustain the slave, and because he doesn't have that obligation, it is always better for the slave to be free, right? That's what they're actually proving by way of all this discussion, that it is always to the slave's advantage to be free, and therefore, if a master sends a bill of manumission via an agent of delivery, the agent of delivery can always accept it on behalf of the slave. Now, the Gemara raises an objection. But from the fact that the last clause teaches, and if the husband said to his wife, spend your earnings to sustain yourself, he is permitted to act accordingly. So from that, it may be inferred that the first half of the last clause is referring to a case where he did not say this to her. So the Gemara explains that this is what the Brisa is saying. And if her earnings suffice to pay for her sustenance, and he said to her, spend your earnings and sustain yourself, it is permitted for him to say that. But if her earnings do not suffice, it's not permitted because he's always on the hook to feed his wife, unlike a master and a slave. Now the Gemara asks, if the Baraisa is referring to a case where her earnings suffice, what is the purpose of stating this law with regard to one who was exiled to a city of refuge? The same law applies to all wives. And the Gemara answers, it is necessary lest you say that in light of the verse, all glorious is the king's daughter within the palace, from which it is derived that it is improper for a wife to spend too much time outside her home. So from this, the woman's husband would be concerned that while his wife is in a city of refuge, she should not work outside of her home, but only in the home. Therefore, the Brisa teaches us that there is no need to be concerned about this matter, and her husband may say to her, spend your earnings to sustain yourself, even in a city of refuge, because she had to flee there because she accidentally killed someone. Now, with regard to the question of whether a master can decide to cease providing sustenance for his slave while the slave continues to serve him, the Gemara suggests, let us say that this matter is the subject of a dispute between the rabbis of the Mishna, the Tanaim. As it was taught that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, a slave can say to his master in years of famine, either sustain me from your property or emancipate me. And the rabbis, the majority, said his master has permission to retain his ownership over him without sustaining him. So it's no less a person than the great Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel who says, no, if you can't sustain your slave, you have to free him. But he lost that argument with the majority. And what is it not correct to say that they disagree about this issue? That one sage, meaning the majority, holds that a master can say to his slave that he should work for him and he will not, and the master will not sustain him. Whereas the other sage, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, says you cannot do that. So consequently, he is not required to emancipate him even when he cannot provide for him. And the other sage, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, holds that the master cannot say this. Now the Gemara responds, no. How can you understand that dispute between Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel and the rabbis in this way? If so, this expression, either sustain me or emancipate me, is inaccurate, as the Baraisa should have said, either sustain me or give me my earnings for my sustenance. And furthermore, if the dispute concerns this general issue, what is different about years of famine? The same dispute should apply in all years. Rather, with what are we dealing here? The Baraisa is referring to a case where the master said to the slave, spend your earnings to sustain yourself. And subsequently, during years of famine, the slave's earnings do not suffice to provide himself with sustenance because prices are higher than usual. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel holds that in this case, the slave can then say to his master, either sustain me or emancipate me, so that people will see me in my helpless state, and they will have mercy on me and provide me with charity. And the rabbis who disagree with Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel hold that this is not a justification for emancipating a Canaanite slave, as those who have mercy on free men will also have mercy on a slave. Consequently, it is not necessary for the slave to be emancipated for him to receive help from generous people. According to this interpretation, the Baraisa has no bearing on the question as to whether a master can say to his slave, work for me, but I will not sustain you. We haven't proven whether that's permissible or not. The Gemara offers a different suggestion. Come in here a proof from a statement that Rav said. In the case of one who consecrates the hands of his slave, if you consecrate anything, right, you're giving it over to, for example, the temple, right? So if you consecrate a sheep, there's different ways you could consecrate it. You could consecrate it as terumah, and it has to be given to a priest. You could consecrate it for temple upkeep when the temple is standing. You could consecrate it to be an offering, right? You could take a pile of money. You could consecrate it in any number of ways. But what you do when you consecrate it is you lose its value for yourself. Now it becomes dedicated to holiness, right? So if you consecrate, for example, a donkey to give it to the temple so that, the priests who do labor in the service of the temple, or the Levium who do stuff for the temple, will now use that donkey, for the needs of the temple. Okay, so then you can no longer work your own donkey because you've consecrated it to the temple. Now, what's interesting here is that you don't consecrate the slave, You're not giving the slave to the temple. You're consecrating the hands of the slave, meaning the labor that the slave produces, the product of his work, that's consecrated. So now the slave can no longer do work for you. If you consecrated the hands of your slave, he can no longer work for you. Any work that he does can only be for the benefit of the temple. Can a person do that? Apparently. Right? So come in here a proof from the statement that Rav said. In the case of one who consecrates the hands of his slave, so that all the work he does becomes temple property, preventing the slave from working on his own, and that actually prevents the slave from working on his own behalf. Right? Before he could work some for himself when his master allowed it, and for the master. But once the master says all the work of your hands is consecrated to the temple, then the slave can't even work for himself. Right? So preventing the slave from working on his own behalf. So then what does the slave do? The slave borrows and eats, and afterwards performs work and repays what he borrowed, as will be explained. Conclude from Rav's statement that the master is able to say to his slave, work for me, but I will not sustain you. In this case, the master has prevented his slave from working for himself, and yet he is not required to sustain the slave. And the Gemara answers, no. You don't understand the circumstances. With what are we dealing here? This is referring to a case where the master provides sustenance for the slave. So the Gemara raises a difficulty. If so, for what reason does he find it necessary to borrow and eat? Why would the slave need to borrow funds so that he could feed himself, which he then has to repay? If the master is sustaining him, why does he have to borrow at all? And the Gemara answers, this is referring to surplus food, i.e. additional food that the slave wants to eat. The master is giving him his basic needs. The slave would like to have extra food, extra niceties, luxuries, right? That he formerly was able to do work on his own. You actually see this even in slavery is at all times a horrific institution. But interestingly, you see some parallels between ancient slavery and modern slavery. When Nina and I made the movie Saving Lincoln, we learned quite a bit about Elizabeth Keckley, who was a woman who grew up in slavery in the American South, became a very skilled dressmaker, and was actually able to, even while providing services to the slave owner, was able to also earn money for herself. And in that way, over time, saved enough money to purchase her freedom and that of her son. She then became an extremely high fashion sort of dress designer and dressmaker, and ended up becoming the dressmaker to the First Lady, to Mary Lincoln. Kind of an interesting story. So, here we're talking about a slave who, provides work to the master and is able to do enough work to provide for himself or herself. But if the master consecrates the hands of the slave, now they don't have that opportunity to do for themselves because all of their work is consecrated for the use of the temple. And so even if the master is sustaining the slave, they're going to lose that opportunity to provide surplus for themselves, that the surplus work would be for themselves. It is to the surplus. So the Gemara, and now we're on 12b. And the Gemara raises a difficulty. But if so, let the temple treasurer say to him, until now it was enough for you without a surplus. Now too it should be enough for you without a surplus. Why do you seek more now? Consequently, the consecration should apply to the surplus as well. And the Gemara answers, it is preferable to the temple treasury itself that the slave work and eat more, so that the value of its slave will be enhanced when he consumes this extra amount, as he will become stronger. Now, it was stated that the slave borrows and eats and afterward performs work and repays the loan. And the Gemara asks, but this work immediately becomes consecrated, as his hands have been consecrated. How then can he repay the loan when he borrows in order to eat? And the Gemara answers, the slave performs work of less than the value of 1 peruta. Anything less than 1 peruta, which is like a penny, does not become consecrated. Therefore, he can collect these small sums and repay the debt little by little. Yeah, but if he has to keep borrowing to eat, how will he ever get ahead? Now, the Gemara comments, so too it is reasonable that Rav is referring to a case where the master provides sustenance for the slave. As Rav says, with regard to one who consecrates the hands of his slave, the slave works and eats, as if the slave does not work for himself, who will work and provide for him? And this ruling indicates that Rav maintains that consecration does not apply to the slave's hands. And the Gemara explains, granted, if you say that this earlier law that Rav said that the slave borrows and repays refers to a situation where his master provides sustenance for him, and this is because in general he cannot say to him, work for me, but I will not sustain you. And the second halakha is referring to a case where his master does not provide him with sustenance, and therefore the master cannot consecrate the slave's hands, then it is all well and good, as there is no contradiction between the two statements of Rav. However, if you say that this first law is also speaking of a case where the master does not provide sustenance for him, and the consecration is effective because he can say to his slave, work for me and I will not sustain you, then what is the meaning of the statement as if the slave does not work for himself, who will work for him? Let whoever desires work for him, i.e. the slave will be compelled to sustain himself from charity, but this is not the master's concern. Rather, must one not conclude from here that Rav holds that a master cannot say to his slave, work for me, but I will not sustain you. And the Gemara comments, indeed, conclude from here that this is the case. Rav holds that a master cannot say, work for me, and I will not sustain you. Now the Gemara suggests, come in here another source concerning the same dilemma. As Rabbi Yochanan says, one who severs the hand of another person's slave, one who severs the hand, let's say accidentally, but you cause a slave that doesn't belong to you, that belongs to someone else, to lose a hand. Okay, so again, forget modern, morality. Think in ancient times where slavery was common. So if you damage somebody else's slave, you have caused financial damage. It's terrible physical damage, emotional damage to the slave, but you've also caused financial damage to the slave owner. Right, so Rabbi Yochanan says, one who severs the hand of another person's slave must give compensation for this loss of livelihood, i.e. compensation for the slave's inability to work as a result of his injury, and also the slave's medical costs, which is an expense to the master. And that slave who can no longer work is sustained from charity. Now conclude from Rabbi Yochanan's statement that the master is able to say to his slave, work for me, but I will not sustain you. Since the slave can no longer work, and Rabbi Yochanan doesn't say, well, the slave can no longer work, so free him. Rather, the slave can no longer work. The master gets compensated for the financial loss of the one who caused him not to be able to work. And then the slave lives off charity. Not the slave lives off, the master continues to sustain him. So that would seem to be a proof of this principle that it is possible to say, work for me and I will not sustain you to a slave. And the Gemara answers, with what are we dealing here? This is referring to a case where his master provides sustenance for him. And the Gemara asks, well, if so, then why is he sustained from charity? He already has sustenance. And the Gemara answers, this is referring to surplus food, i.e. additional food that the slave wants to eat beyond what he needs. So that's what he's going to go to charity for. Now the Gemara raises a difficulty. If so, the phrase sustained from charity is imprecise, as it indicates that he is provided only with enough for his basic needs. If you're talking about charitable sustenance, that's not going to go beyond basic needs. So it should have said he earns a living from charity. Rather, must one not conclude from this statement that Rabbi Yochanan maintains that the master can say to his slave, work for me, but I will not sustain you? And the Gemara comments, indeed, conclude from here that this is the case, according to this opinion, that you can say, work for me and I will not sustain you. Now, the Gemara discusses this law that we just mentioned. The master says earlier, if the one causes another person's slave to lose a hand, he must give compensation for the slave's loss of livelihood and his medical costs to his master. Now the Gemara comments with regard to compensation for loss of livelihood, well, it is obvious that this is the law, as the master incurs the loss when his slave can no longer work. And therefore it is necessary for the sages to mention only that the compensation for his medical costs goes to his master. And the Gemara comments, why is the payment for his medical costs given to the master? Shouldn't the compensation for his medical costs belong to him, as he needs to be healed with it? And the Gemara answers, no, it is necessary in the case where the doctors estimated that the blow or the wound would heal in 5 days, and they made a strong medicine for him, and he was healed in 3 days instead of 5. Lest you say, since the pain suffered by the slave by taking the strong medicine that caused a decrease in the costs of healing was his, the slave's, so the money should belong to him, This baraisa teaches rather that it is not the case, and even this money that is saved in the medical expenses belongs to the master. With regard to the discussion in the Mishnah between Rabbi Meir and the rabbis, right, about is it ever to the slave's benefit to remain a slave? Yes, because Rabbi Meir said he can continue to eat terumah. With regard to that, it is taught in a baraisa, Tosefta 1.5, that Rabbi Elazar said, we said to Meir, but isn't it in the interest of a slave to leave his master to freedom? Isn't it always in the interest of a slave to be free? And he said to us, it is to his detriment if he were the slave of a priest, because by emancipating him, he is disqualified from eating terumah. So we said to Meir, but what would be if the master wishes not to sustain him and not to provide him with a living? He is permitted to do so. Therefore, the slave does not lose out when he is emancipated, as he was not guaranteed sustenance in any event. He was not guaranteed to receive terumah in any event. Rabbi Meir said to us, even if the master is not obligated to provide for him, it is still permitted for the slave to partake of terumah. And the proof for this is the following. And what would be if there were the slave of a priest who fled from his master, or in the case of the wife of a priest who rebelled against her husband, i.e. she refused to fulfill her obligations as a married woman? Are they not permitted to partake of terumah, although not the terumah belonging to the master or husband? They are permitted to partake of terumah, right? The runaway slave who was owned by a priest can actually continue eating terumah wherever he is, because he's owned by a priest, and therefore he can eat terumah. But this slave who was emancipated, he may not partake of terumah at all, even terumah that belongs to other priests. But in any event, in the case of a woman, a bill of divorce is to her detriment, as it disqualifies her from partaking of terumah and causes her to lose her sustenance, which is guaranteed for a wife. And the Gemara analyzes this baraisa. What did the rabbis say to Rabbi Meir, and what did he respond to them? In other words, the two sides do not appear to be discussing the same issue, as the rabbis refer to sustenance, while Rabbi Meir talks about terumah. So the Gemara explains that this is what Rabbi Meir is saying to them. You have answered me about sustenance, that the master is not required to provide for his slave. However, what will you answer me about terumah? And if you were to say that the acceptance of the document by the agent is not to the slave's detriment, as in any case if the master desires, he can throw the bill of manumission within 4 cubits of the slave and thereby disqualify him from partaking of terumah, the slave can prevent this from occurring by leaving his master and escaping and going out to the world. The slave doesn't want to give up eating terumah. Instead of receiving his emancipation from the master, he runs away. Either way, he's going to be out in the world not working for his master. But because he's a runaway slave, he can keep eating terumah, as opposed to a freed former slave who would not be able to eat terumah. Now we're at the top of 13a, and I'm almost done. So you got questions or comments, get them in. I'm just reaching a natural stopping point. And Rabbi Meir further said to the rabbis, and what would be if there was the slave of a priest who fled from his master, or the wife of a priest who rebelled against her husband? Are they not permitted to partake of terumah? Although not the terumah belonging to the master or the husband? They are permitted. But this slave who was emancipated may not partake. And the Gemara asks, so if so, Rabbi Meir is saying and responding well to the rabbis. How would the rabbis counter his claim? And Rava said this is what they answered and said to him in the Mishnah. The master can disqualify his slave from partaking of terumah in any event, because he is his master's acquisition. The implication of this statement is the following: as if the master desires to disqualify his slave from partaking of terumah after he has fled, even after he has fled, he can take 4 dinars from any Israelite in exchange for the slave, and he thereby disqualifies him from partaking of terumah anywhere that he is located. How will the slave find out? We're just talking about the technical law. The Gemara asks, and according to the opinion of Rabbi Meir, this explanation works out well with regard to the slave of a priest, whose emancipation causes him to be disqualified from partaking of terumah, and therefore it is possible to argue that his emancipation is to his detriment. However, with regard to the slave of an Israelite, what can be said? There's no terumah in question. So if putting aside the case of a slave owned by a priest, it would seem that if he's owned by any other Israelite or Levite, it's always to his advantage to be free. And you can't bring up this one little argument of Rabbi Meir that where it could be to the detriment of a slave not to be free with regard to terumah. So Rabbi Shmuel Bar Rav Yitzchak says, emancipation is even to the detriment of the slave of an Israelite, because by freeing him, his master causes him to lose the option of engaging in sexual intercourse with a Canaanite maidservant, with a Canaanite female slave. Until this point, it was permitted for him to engage in sexual intercourse with a Canaanite maidservant, but once he is emancipated, these women are forbidden to him. Slaves can only have physical relations with other slaves, not with free people under the law. So wouldn't he rather be available to all the free people in the world than keep his right to sleep with other slaves who happen to be female? And the Gemara raises a difficulty. On the contrary, by emancipating him, the master renders it permitted for him to engage in sexual intercourse with a free woman. That's an advantage. And the Gemara answers, in the case of a slave, this is the lowly condition of Canaanite slaves, in the case of a slave, a life of licentiousness is preferable for him. Therefore, he would rather have the right to engage in sexual intercourse with a Canaanite maidservant, as she is lowly to him, she is available for him, she is unrestricted for him. None of these descriptions apply to a Jewish woman, and therefore he loses out on the benefit he could have received by being permitted to engage in sexual intercourse with a Canaanite maidservant. Consequently, Rabbi Meir maintains that his emancipation is to his detriment. But Rabbi Meir lost that argument. So the rabbis, the majority, ruled that it is always to the advantage of a slave to be free. Period. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 5 here in chapter 1. Tomorrow we'll pick it up with Mishnah number 6. It's late. Let me take one or two questions. On Gittin, page 12. Sharon, women could in fact earn. There are a lot of biblical and Talmudic examples of women in business or performing skilled work. Look at the woman of valor in the book of Proverbs. Of course, maybe you're arguing with somebody else in the comments, but of course women could earn, and that's why there's the whole body of law where the husband can say to the wife, keep your earnings and sustain yourself. Because that's going to be to her advantage. That's only permissible because it's to her advantage. She then doesn't have to turn over all those other earnings. Now, when we discussed that back in Kesubos, and maybe we'll do it again in Kedushin, the idea was the husband is still entitled to some part of her earnings. Which part, that's a whole other body of law. But for sure, there were women who were business women, even in that ancient world, and who did quite well for themselves. That's... I see. Sharon was talking with Joseph. Okay, great. That's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Wednesday, at the regular time.